Hello, here we are looking at how to go about optimizing websites for performance. It's part of a series I'm making on my page builder, Beaver Builder. But what I'm talking about here is not specific to any builder. I should be getting more hands-on in later videos, but this is an overview. As someone who is more of a dabbler than an expert in website performance, I know how easy it is to waste time and money looking in all the wrong places. Sure, optimizing can get technical with lots of strange terminology, metrics, and tools, but I think Google Core Web Vitals has made the principles remarkably simple. Knowing what to prioritize and what techniques are available is probably 80% of the battle, and that's what I'm talking about here. Before I come off camera, I'm David Wormsey. I make client websites and try and share what I'm learning along the way. If this is your kind of thing, then I'd love it if you clicked on the red subscribe button below. Anyway, let's get started. The good news is we don't have to tackle everything related to a whole page load to get great results. Whatever we think of Google, they have helped us to prioritize. Performance is now a measure of a visitor's experience, and it's how fast and smoothly things are loading into the viewports of their devices that matter. When we stop looking at the whole page load and focus on viewports, things start to look a bit different. And there is this fabulous article and YouTube video by Sabrina Zidan. She used to work for WP Rocket and now earns a crust optimizing other people's sites, and she busts a number of myths related to generic advice that may not help speed up a site. So things like get better hosting, remove plugins, add a CDN. Now these all may be good things, but they may not speed up a site, and context is very much needed. And what I really like about her video, and I've shared a screenshot here, is that she nicely demonstrates how it's not really the number of assets and requests that we are making on a page, but how and when these are served to a visitor. So she shows these two sites. There is this news website, and she's looking at the mobile view with each of these, and there are 515 requests, and it's 4 megabytes. And she compares it with this WordPress dog walkers site, which only has 17 requests, and it's just over a megabyte. But as you can see here, by the largest contentful paint, that is the time it takes to load the largest element in the viewport. And in this case, it will be a 3G simulated connection, so it's mobile speeds. This comes in at 2.6 seconds, and this one comes in at 7.8 seconds. So you can see that the experience is going to be so much better on the new site, which has a lot more requests than it is with the dog walker, and this is much more likely to pass Core Web Vitals. What I used to do in the earlier days when I did optimization, I would be looking at my pages and the assets and the kind of requests that being made, and I would be trying to remove as many of those as I could, really blindly. And I think these days there are even more tools so we can blindly just tick on boxes. So we have things like asset cleanup, which is freely available on the repository, and there is a pro version. Performance Matters, which I like a bit more, and there's Flying Press, as well as a whole bunch of add-on extras to our caching plugins. What I found is that it's just too easy if you don't know what you're doing and create an error or break functionality. Commonly I see people breaking their mobile navigation, even just using something like WP Rocket, which is quite simple because they've deferred some JavaScript. It's probably best to not employ any of these things until after you've covered all of the fundamental stuff. So it's best to leave your caching plugins off while you're optimizing, so you can see how well your server is performing, and then you can add that later to help with the load impact. What I've generally found, and I think it'll be true for most of my clients with our largely simple sites, is that I will never use these. I think just a few snippets in my child themes functions PHP file will replace the main benefits of these optimization plugins. Also, something I used to do, I do less now, but I'm still intrigued, is start chasing after the fastest theme builder and hosting. I think unless you know that your tools are actually preventing you from getting a good performance through doing some optimization, it's much easier to learn one set of tools, because what you learn about how that works, you can take it into the next time you're doing some optimization. Naturally, a lot of people are talking about Gutenberg because, of course, it's going to be the lightest option. It's baked into WordPress, but many many of us got our page builders for our clients' ease, and of course it comes with some associated bloat. But for most people, Gutenberg needs something extra. It doesn't have the kind of layout system that you would expect from a page builder, so it hasn't yet got that associated bloat. So most people need to get third-party blocks or themes, and then they're back to dealing with the same optimization efforts, and they maybe even minus the benefits they had with their first page builder. There was something that really set me off on doing these videos, and that was some comment that came in at the Beaver Builder Facebook group. And it was true, they loaded this template in and they did a page speed insights test on it, and on mobile it was coming in at something like 70 or the early 80 figures. It wasn't particularly good on that, and they felt that Beaver Builder was slow on performance and they were going to move to some other solution, and they were doing that reluctantly because they like Beaver Builder. They are absolutely right about the speeds that were here on this particular template, but as I found out with this one, all that needed to be done was to swap out the background image that was in the viewport for mobiles. So I just used the settings that were there to be able to swap for a smaller image. It looks exactly the same, and suddenly I can get the top scores with it. So it's very easy to end up looking completely in the wrong places, or changing your tools unnecessarily. What I suggest we do focus on, or at least what I'm focusing on, is the largest contentful pane. As I've mentioned, that's the time it takes to load the largest element in the viewport, and we're only going to focus on the mobile view and the mobile speeds we'll be simulating for a 3G connection. And let's just remind ourselves of the other core vitals. So we have largest contentful pane, but the other two probably need less attention. The first input delay is only a field metric, so unless Google go and give us some information, we won't know about that. But it's about interactivity, how long it takes to be interactive. Chances are everything is going to be fine with most builders and WordPress. Maybe you might have an issue if you're bringing in some third-party scripts and they're throwing things out, but largely it's going to be easy to fix. Same with cumulative layout shift, which relates to visual stability, how things are moving around while the load is going on. In most cases, unless there's a big JavaScript library that's coming in and throwing stuff out, it's probably just a case of setting some specific widths to your images, embeds, and iframes. So we're going to focus on largest contentful pane, and of course, because we're looking at viewports, we're going to be looking at the headers and hero sections of our pages, and we'll be interested in what needs to load first in terms of images, CSS, JavaScript, fonts, etc., to be able to show that largest element. And first, of course, we're going to need to know where that largest element is, and fortunately Google PageSpeed Insights lets us know. So let's just go and have a look over here and just toggle onto this. And fortunately, in this case, it makes it a lot easier. It is an image. If it's just a piece of text, of course, that's going to be in your main HTML and not so easy to find. But as it is an image, we can kind of guess where that is loading if we look at a load waterfall. So we can use a number of different tools. We've got the web page test site here, which I've used and I've run a test. It can simulate an iPhone. So we can see where it is loading here, and get some other information about our time to first byte over here. Let me go to GT metrics, which I think is sometimes a lot easier to read. So we can see we've got a fairly good time to first byte, and most stuff is loading. Where have we got this here? It's right on the bottom. So at least on this load, and it's going to change, I guess, each time you try and load this, things will load in a different order, and it's going to show differently on different measurement tools. But we can see probably we want to be looking at all these above because we found this. Not going to be so easy if it's text. We're going to have to take a guess. But we're going to be looking to see if anything's holding up here, if there's something that shouldn't be there at all, anything duplicated, whether we've got any mixed content, so we're having to divert to a HTTPS version from a HTTP version. Those can really hold things up. But really, things look pretty okay, even though it's coming quite late here. It's fine, but there are other techniques. If I feel I need to move this up, I can preload it to have it served up a bit earlier, but I'll talk about this in a moment. There is another clue that we get from PageSpeed Insights. If we go over to here, we have eliminate our render blocking resources. When we are loading our page, we are creating the DOM with our HTML, but within that, it's going to reference other files, and when it does that, the loading of the DOM has to pause while it goes and references those files. So they're getting in the way of showing our largest contentful element. So we want to take a look at these and see if we want to do anything about these. There are techniques to be able to defer any of these, so it'll speed up the load. In this particular case, I'm not going to worry. These two are fairly small, at least compressed, and well coded. So they are not creating a block, and it's a bit of a pain to defer CSS because we have to put something in there, some inline CSS, which we have to create. So this is not an issue. You know, according to the waterfall, all that stuff seems to load pretty quickly, so I'm still getting a good result. So I'm not going to bother messing around, but there may be circumstances where there's stuff in there which is pretty surprising and you want to know about it. The main thing that loads here is really coming from WordPress, and that's the jQuery library. Most JavaScript is loading in the footer, but with jQuery it's loading in WordPress in the header because there are going to be things that are going to be dependent on that loading first. That's the case with Beaver Builder. If some of your modules are needing JavaScript, chances are that it's going to be relying on this jQuery coming in first. And if you don't have it coming first, if we defer it, then we may not see the issue, but it may create an error, and then that will just slow down the site any further. Probably nothing to learn on that, but this is a good area to look to see. Ask the question whether we need to move things around. But what I'm looking at is how safe we are here. We are looking to get under 2.5 seconds and 1.5 seconds. I'm pretty okay. I think I'm probably going to pass Core Web Vitals on this page in most cases. If it was a bit closer, then I might look a bit harder at what we've got there. There is another way of looking at what's going on here as well, something that might be helpful. I've got to thank Nathan Wrigley for pointing this out. I kind of knew of it before, I just didn't get the significance of it, but he watched something from Google people and they pointed this out. So in our Chromium tools, if we've got a Chromium browser, I'm using Chrome in this case, we should have our inspector tools, and we can do a lot of clever stuff with performance monitoring. But this one, which is quite easy to understand, is called coverage. You can find this by going to 3 dots here, going to more tools and clicking this on, and we can run our device and we can see all the scripts here, and we can get a visual representation of how much the code is being used on these. So jQuery in this case, let's have a look, shows us what in the code here. Now Google folks seem to call this green, but it looks like blue to me. So the blue is when it's being used and the red is when it's not being used. Now I'm using a different page here so we can see the jQuery. I'm using 35% of that too, but if we have a look at this page, that's probably very likely. So let's just go over to this. This is the page. It's got a lot of modules on it, these counters. We've got this kind of slider thing going on. We've got another counter, and we've got all of that going on as well. So not too surprising to find out that this is using jQuery. There's some dependencies. Often this is going to be the largest element that I've got, the jQuery, and it may be only being used 99% of the time on it. So this is what we find, but it could be quite handy. Let's go and have a look at the page speed insight test I did on the same page here, and what we can see on this one is we've got this extra CSS. We've got this magnific pop-up.min CSS. It's tiny, compressed, so we probably wouldn't worry, but you know, there's a potential saving according to them. So we might take a look at that and see, do we need it? Do we only need the JavaScript, or do we need the CSS that's going with that? So we can go down here. In fact, let's go and filter on the CSS. And here it is, 100% not used. It's small. Do we worry about it? Or is it really? And this is the danger. And this is how I ended up with trouble that I mentioned before with breaking mobile navigation and that kind of thing. You need to look at what's functioning. So a good guesswork here would be that the pop-ups are related to this, and if I go and click on one of those pop-ups, well, there we go. Let's have a look. There we are. Suddenly we are starting to use the stuff in there. So over 1/4 of the code is being used. Let's have a little look at that. there we are. So we can see suddenly the code is being used. It may not be too helpful. I think we should expect that we're going to have a certain amount of unused code that we won't want to get rid of, but occasionally you're going to find something that's 100% unused and shouldn't be there at all, or you might want to think about certain things that you're going to remove from the load at all. This is stuff that I'll try and cover in examples in the next video. Okay, let me go back to my notes. I think that's all I need to say on that. Quickly, I'll just mention over how we might go about optimizing the whole site. In the last video, I mentioned something I misled, really. I misunderstood. In fact, I did know, but I kind of in the moment of recording got it wrong. So I was talking about the field data that comes in that lets us know whether we actually pass Core Web Vitals, the stuff coming in through anonymized users, Chrome users going to your site, and we need to be 75% in the green. That needs to be the experience for more than 75% of people on our largest contentful pane. When I was mentioning the origin summary, I said original summary and was treating it as such, as if it was an earlier version of this. What this actually is a sum total of what it knows about your site, your domain. And the interesting thing is, as far as I understand, although someone can correct me if I'm wrong, Google are not allowing us to hide any pages. So of course, generally the idea would to work on the pages that are going to be most visited first, but we might also want to consider those shameful pages that we might have that might be terrible for optimization, because they might bring down the cumulative total for our origin summary. And on pages that don't have their own field data, that might be all that is going to be displayed. So something to consider there. There is a great article, thanks to David McCann for putting this out, from Smashing Magazine, which goes into a lot more detail, particularly about the field data. I was hoping that I'm going to get some field data on my testing site here, but there is another technique which I can add in so I can get that kind of information even if Google hasn't picked up on it. And there's also a lot more you can do about looking into the data set that they hold. One other thing to point out is that when it comes to Core Web Vitals as a ranking factor, there may be reasons why you are not able to get things loading faster in your viewport. Maybe that's not the way that your business is, but the chances are that's going to be true of your competitors, and you only really need to do better than your competitors. Okay, for the rest of this video, I'm going to run through the things that might help us improve our largest contentful paint. Most of these are going to be obvious. So image optimization, concentrating on the viewport. I want to make sure that we're serving up the smallest file sizes, and I use Short Pixel myself to do that. We also want to serve up the sizes most appropriate to the device that's loading it. So getting rid of those really big background images and serving a small one for the mobile devices. And maybe even considering adding some CSS so we remove the background image for mobiles only. We might want to consider using SVGs where there's vector style imagery needed. Perhaps that's going to be for your logos. I've been experimenting with the WebP format, which comes from Google, and I think is undoubtedly the smallest file size you can get without deteriorating the quality of the image. Paul Lacey, a friend of mine, has also been on a similar journey, and he's been experimenting with the same thing. At the moment, WebP as a format isn't supported everywhere, so we have something like, on browser support, something like 91 to 94%. It's Safari that's holding us back. So of course we can't not serve images to those people. For the moment, we have to have some system that swaps out if the browser supports it. What we suspect is that the gain that we will get in the smaller file sizes is lost as there is that process of trying to swap over to a WebP format. So we haven't really seen any benefits. I guess it's something we both need to look into. I've largely ignored a little warning that might come up from Google PageSpeed Insights about serving images in the next-gen format. That includes WebP, also includes some other JPEG formats, which only have something like 2% support. So I've ignored that. Maybe it'll go away at some point. It's still something to look into. I don't know how WordPress will handle it. If you create WebP format files and you upload them, then WordPress won't by default work in the normal way. It won't create crops as it would do with normal images. So I think this is something for the near future. I do need to do my own research into WordPress's support of source set. Source set is a way where if there are images available, smaller ones available, it will put those into the HTML, and according to the browser, it will serve the most appropriate one. I know that Paul Lacey has been specifically setting those out, getting rid of it, doing that, and serving up individually for different size devices their own images. So again, something for me to explore, as well as some of the lazy loading that's just come into WordPress as well. Okay, the next thing, and probably the most important, will be our hosting or our caching. So the time to first byte with WordPress is time it's going to take for WordPress to process its PHP functions and query the database. Then the more resource heavy plugins and themes that we have mean that that's going to be slowed down unless we have enough server power to be able to get over that. Most of the time though, to speed things up, we are adding caching because we are protecting ourselves against lots of people visiting the site at the same time. I tend to use WP Rocket, but there are plenty of free options on this site. I'm testing out Cache Enabler, which I quite like, and I've also talked about Breeze before. Maybe I'll do another video looking again at the caching options. Fonts, of course, are something which are third-party stuff that needs to load. Mostly we are using Google Fonts, and it does slow down our sites quite a lot. So we might want to consider going back to the old days where we consider stacks of web-safe fonts, and I think there are more fonts on people's systems. So it might be worth looking at some of the articles. That's what I've done on this site. Also, partly related here is that often I'm using the Font Awesome library, which is getting larger all the time. So we can now, and there's an article for Beaver Builder users where we can create our own smaller font sets that will increase with our loading, particularly if we just want something to add to our buttons as directional things. We're not really using fonts much. Seems too much to have to load something like 60 KB of Font Awesome CSS. Or we might want to consider again using SVGs, and we might want to consider whether we want to locally load our fonts. A lot of people are doing this because of GDPR concerns in Europe, and it's arguable whether there's an increase. Some people will say there's a WP Rocket article which shows their experiments with it, and they think that Google's CDN system is going to be much quicker than loading locally. In my own experience, and I know that is Paul Lacey's experience doing a similar thing, locally loading fonts has been better. He's been using a plugin. I'll need to explore this more, but on the Zen template that I'm using here, I'm locally loading it, but I'm doing it manually. So I'm going over to this site and I'm changing the Google fonts into a web format and then presenting that. Also, we might just want to check these basic things that we've got some kind of compressing working, because it's going to affect our file load. Gzipping is working here, as we can see. We want to probably make sure that our server is set up and supporting HTTP2. HTTP1 was restricting us in the number of connections that it could make, and that led us to mostly combining our CSS files into one and our JavaScript files into one. These days, if we've got HTTP2, it's probably not beneficial to do that at all. We might want to consider our designs, maybe when we are setting up our hero sections for mobile, that we'll want to be setting them to 100% viewport height, so we know what we've got covered, and when Google's doing its test, it's not going to be looking at the below the fold content, which might be heavier, and maybe removing the background images on mobiles, as I've mentioned before. I think it's a really good time for those of us who want to argue that most people just want a good headline, a good reason for why they need to stay on that page and go further. And once we've got past that first header and they've got a reason, then we can largely put in as much content as we like. There's a lot of animation and extra stuff. So maybe a good argument for those who like to argue against viewport sliders rather than adding some simple messaging. We might want to be looking at the plugins if we haven't got caching on, or the caching needs to refresh every so often, or we've got dynamic sites where we can't use caching. Then we might want to look at the heavy plugins that we use. I did a video on usage DD. It's probably not the best way of finding out whether a plugin's heavy, but it's a start with that. And the other considerations here are sort of things that I'll be following up in other videos. So we might want to consider whether we're going to defer the load of CSS and JavaScript. There's a technique for CSS, but we need to add in some inline CSS. It's also a feature that's in WP Rocket, and I think I've seen it in some other caching plugins. I've not been using it because it creates a flash and creates another issue, because my critical inline CSS has never been quite as it should be. We can also use some simple techniques to defer all the JavaScript except jQuery, and this simple script will work for that. I've been looking into doing a bit of preloading, prefetching, and pre-connecting and lazy loading of assets. I'll be talking about that later. But it is effectively another way of moving stuff around in our waterfall to make sure that our largest contentful paint element is loading quick enough. We might want to consider dequeuing some unused CSS and JavaScript, again, if we found that by using the coverage in our Chromium browser. We want to check for our console errors. I've got a video on one of my templates here, DJ. The original background image to that was 4.5 megabytes. I got it down by using this open source software Handbrake to, I think, 350 kilobytes or something around that. I also use a plugin. If I'm not using Gutenberg at all throughout the site, then I use Jeff Starr's Disable Gutenberg because it removes the block CSS, which is growing all the time. Probably, as mentioned before, our biggest performance killers are third-party scripts that come in, things from videos, maps, fonts, analytics, tracking scripts, live chat applications, GDPR, and cookie notifications, pop-ups, etc. The list goes on and on. I think really we always have to be mindful that this is just one of over 200 ranking factors in Google. We already make some compromises when we are choosing WordPress and page builders for the benefits that it brings, and with that it means that we're probably likely to have some unused HTML, CSS and JavaScript. It needs to be there ready for if our clients need to change things. So we have to be quite measured, I think, about how much we're going to clean up, but I think we can allow for a lot of flexibility and still get the very top scores. There's just a balance to be found. Anyway, that brings me to the end of this video. I hope it was useful. Please give me a thumbs up if it was, and I hope to see you again in another video. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.